A presiding judge formally ruled that significant fraud had occurred, assets were immediately frozen, and the attorneys involved were sanctioned, all unfolding within a stunningly brief matter of hours. I want you to truly let that reality sink in for a moment. This is not merely a rumor circulating on social media, it is not a leak from an anonymous source, and it is certainly not a headline constructed on the shaky foundation of speculation. A court of law stepped in decisively and said enough is enough, triggering one of the most aggressive and consequential legal maneuvers ever aimed directly at a former president of the United States. When courts move with this kind of unprecedented speed, it is usually a clear indication that something incredibly serious has already been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Here is the specific part of this narrative that should make you pause and reconsider everything you thought you knew. This legal battle did not start yesterday. It did not originate from political maneuvering or intense media pressure. It came directly from thousands of documents, sworn testimony given under oath, and financial records that simply did not add up upon closer inspection. Judges do not make the drastic decision to freeze assets unless they genuinely believe that money could vanish into thin air, properties could shift ownership overnight, or the truth could be buried deep underground before real accountability ever arrives. So, how exactly did this situation escalate so quickly? Why were Trump's highly experienced lawyers pushed to the absolute edge of their capabilities? And what precise factors compelled the court to pull the trigger on such a massive decision within a mere 24-hour window? Please stay with us through this explanation, because the underlying reasons behind this aggressive legal move are far more shocking and complex than the headlines would have you believe. If this detailed breakdown made you stop in your tracks and think critically about the situation, drop a comment below sharing the one question that you still can't seem to shake from your mind. We read every single one of your thoughts. These videos require a significant amount of real effort, genuine research, and valuable time to produce. So, if you appreciate this content, please subscribe to support our work. It is literally just one simple click for you, but it helps us more than you could possibly imagine. Jai. This is the specific part of the story that most headlines tend to gloss over, yet it stands as the single most important reason why everything escalated with such breathtaking speed. A judge did not merely suggest that fraud might have possibly happened. A judge did not state that the situation needs significantly more investigation before a conclusion can be reached. The court ruled definitively that fraud had already occurred. That is a massive, undeniable legal line to cross in any judicial proceeding. In this specific case, the judge issued what is legally known as a summary judgment, which essentially means that the evidence presented was so strong, so clear, and so overwhelming on one side that there was absolutely no need for a jury to decide whether fraud existed or not. I want you to think about just how incredibly rare that is in a high-profile case. Courts usually bend over backward to allow cases to play out slowly and deliberately, giving every benefit of the doubt. But here, the judge looked at the extensive financial statements, examined the valuations, scrutinized the paperwork, and concluded that the facts were simply undisputed. Jai. Properties were systematically overvalued to secure better loans from banks, then subsequently undervalued to pay significantly less in taxes to the government. That is not creative accounting by any stretch of the imagination. That is not a gray area, open to interpretation. That is a clear, undeniable pattern of behavior, and once a judge formally establishes that fraud has occurred, the entire landscape of the case changes instantly. This is precisely why asset freezes suddenly become a viable possibility. Once fraud is legally established as a fact, the court's job shifts dramatically from asking if wrongdoing happened to focusing entirely on preventing further damage from occurring. Judges immediately start asking critical questions. Can these assets be trusted to stay put, or could money be moved? Could properties be transferred to avoid the judgment? Zai. And when the answer to those questions isn't a confident and reassuring no, courts are empowered to act with incredible speed. This ruling effectively removed Trump's biggest shield, the persistent claim that this was all just unproven allegations and political noise. From that moment forward, the case stopped being theoretical and became enforcement-ready. If this explanation gave you a level of clarity that you simply didn't get anywhere else, please leave a comment sharing the one detail that surprised you the most. We genuinely want to hear your perspective on this. These videos take serious effort and deep research to create, so please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. It is just one click for you, and it helps us keep doing this important work. This case didn't blow up into a massive legal crisis because of one bad appraisal or a single sloppy form filled out incorrectly. What pushed the court to act so decisively was the discovery of a repeated, deliberate system of financial manipulation that spanned years. According to the judge's findings, the exact same manipulative behavior showed up again and again across multiple years, across various properties, and across numerous financial statements. That pattern matters immensely because courts simply do not punish accidental errors the same way they punish intentional, calculated conduct. And here, the behavior was decidedly not random. It followed a clear, discernible strategy. The strategy was remarkably simple in its execution. When dealing with banks and lenders to secure capital, asset values were significantly inflated to make the organization look richer, safer, and more creditworthy than it actually was. But when dealing with tax authorities to determine liability, those same assets suddenly became worth much less. Jia. That blatant contradiction is exactly where the case tightens its grip. You cannot legally claim two completely different realities depending entirely on who is asking the question without raising serious legal red flags. Judges look for consistency in financial reporting, and what they found instead was a double-book approach that benefited Trump financially in both directions simultaneously. This is why the court didn't view the fraud as harmless or merely technical in nature. A system like this doesn't just affect a few pieces of paperwork. It fundamentally affects loan terms, insurance costs, and overall market trust. Banks base their risk assessments on these numbers. Insurers price their policies based on them. And when those numbers are manipulated, the entire financial system is effectively misled. Jia. And once a judge concludes that this wasn't accidental but structural in nature, the judicial response becomes aggressive. Courts move to stop the system from continuing, not just to punish what already happened in the past. That is when freezes, sanctions, and broad enforcement powers come into full play. If this explanation made you rethink how financial games actually work at the very top level, drop a comment finishing this sentence. The part that shocked me most was, and if you value this level of detailed breakdown, please subscribe to support the work. It is one click, and it keeps these videos coming to you. This case didn't rely on rumors, leaks, or anonymous sources whispering in the dark. One of the biggest reasons it moved so incredibly fast is because the key accusations were backed by sworn testimony statements made under oath with very real legal consequences for lying. When someone testifies under oath, they are not talking to the media or spinning a narrative, they are talking directly to the court, and courts treat that kind of evidence very differently. In this situation, the testimony directly described exactly how asset values were inflated, who specifically knew about it, and how the process worked internally. What made this especially powerful was that the testimony wasn't vague or general. It named specific executives, described specific practices, and pointed to specific documents that gave investigators a clear roadmap to follow. Jia. Instead of guessing where to look, prosecutors were able to match witness testimony directly to paperwork, bank records, and financial statements. And when those records line up perfectly with what someone has already said under oath, the case stops being speculative and starts becoming verified fact. Judges pay very close attention to that kind of alignment because it shows intent, coordination, and awareness at the very top of the organization. This is also why defenses start to collapse under the weight of the evidence. It is one thing to argue that paperwork was misunderstood or filed incorrectly. It is another thing entirely to explain why sworn testimony matches the documents almost perfectly. Once a judge sees that undeniable connection, the focus shifts from debating the facts to controlling the risk. The courts begin asking whether the same people involved back then still have the ability to move money, shift assets, or reshape records today. That specific concern fuels immediate enforcement decisions. Sworn testimony doesn't just strengthen a case, it anchors it firmly, making fast and decisive action legally justified rather than premature. If this explanation changed how you see testimony and evidence in legal cases, comment with one word that describes your reaction right now. We are truly curious to know what you think. And if you appreciate the depth of work behind these breakdowns, please subscribe to support the channel. It is one click, and it truly helps us keep going. One of the fastest ways to lose credibility in court is when your own numbers start contradicting each other in plain sight. That is exactly what happened here. Financial disclosures submitted in different contexts simply didn't line up, and judges noticed that discrepancy immediately. Courts expect consistency in financial reporting. If the same properties, accounts, or assets appear one way on loan documents and a completely different way in official statements, it raises a massive red flag that something deeper and more deceptive is going on. And in this case, those inconsistencies weren't minor clerical errors. They were repeated, substantial, and patterned. What really intensified the situation was that these discrepancies appeared during active litigation. That is a critical detail to understand. When a court is already examining your finances and new inconsistencies surface, it creates the overwhelming impression that information is either being withheld or selectively disclosed to manipulate the outcome. Judges don't need to prove criminal intent at that stage to take action. They only need to determine whether the court can rely on what it is being shown. Once that trust erodes, the court shifts from passive review to protective action. This is where asset freezes start to make perfect sense from a judicial perspective. If disclosures don't match reality, the court has to assume there is a significant risk. Risk that assets could be moved out of reach. Risk that money could be reclassified to hide it. Risk that the financial picture presented today might look completely different tomorrow. Freezing assets isn't about punishment at this point in the process. It is about preserving the truth and the value, while the court figures out what is real and what isn't. Once a judge believes the financial story keeps changing, the safest move is to stop the clock entirely. If this made you realize how much paperwork alone can change the trajectory of a case, comment numbers matter if you agree, or tell us why you don't. And if you value this kind of deep breakdown, subscribe to the channel. It is just one click, and it helps us keep doing this work. Courts don't freeze assets just because they are upset or suspicious of a defendant. They do it when they believe there is a real, tangible risk that money or property could be moved, hidden, or reshuffled before a case is finished. In this situation, that risk became impossible to ignore. Once fraud was legally established and financial inconsistencies kept surfacing, the court had to ask a critical question. What stops these assets from being moved tomorrow? And when the answer isn't clear, judges act to protect the integrity of the case. This concern isn't theoretical or abstract. Complex business empires make asset movement incredibly easy. Properties can be transferred between entities with a few signatures. Money can be shifted across accounts in seconds. Ownership structures can be adjusted on paper without anyone noticing right away. From a judicial perspective, that capability is dangerous. If a court eventually orders penalties or restitution, but the assets are already gone or tied up elsewhere, the ruling becomes effectively meaningless. So, freezing assets is less about punishment and more about preventing illegal evasion of the court's judgment. That is why timing matters so much in these situations. Once the court believed there was a credible chance of asset dissipation, delay became a risk in itself. Judges aren't required to wait until assets vanish to intervene. They are allowed, and often obligated, to act before that happens. And when you combine established fraud, inconsistent disclosures, and a complex financial structure, the threshold for action drops fast. The freeze sends a clear, unmistakable message. Nothing moves until the court is done counting, verifying, and deciding what consequences are appropriate. It is the legal equivalent of hitting pause before the pieces disappear from the board. If this made you see asset freezes differently, comment with the word pause if you get why courts do this, or explain why you think it goes too far. And if you appreciate the effort behind these deep dives, subscribe to the channel. It is one click, and it keeps this work alive. This part doesn't get nearly enough attention in the mainstream discussion, but it is a huge turning point and explains why the court moves so aggressively. Posting a bond is essentially a promise made to the court. It says, if I lose, the money is there, ready to be paid. It reassures judges that penalties can be paid and that assets won't need to be locked down in the meantime. In high-stakes cases like this, a bond isn't just a formality. It is a pressure release valve for the legal system. And in this situation, that valve was never used. When no bond is posted, the court has to assume there is a significant risk. Risk that funds won't be available later when needed. Risk that assets could be leveraged, transferred, or drained before a final ruling is issued. Judges don't have the luxury of trusting that everything will stay put, especially after fraud has already been established as fact. From the court's perspective, the absence of a bond removes a major safety net, JAR, and when that safety net disappears, the court builds its own safety net through asset freezes. This is why timing matters so much in this context. Once the deadline passed and no bond appeared, the judge didn't need to speculate anymore. The court had to protect its future authority. Because if penalties are eventually imposed and there is no bond and no preserved assets, enforcement becomes a nightmare for the legal system. So the freeze wasn't sudden or arbitrary. It was the logical next step when you don't voluntarily secure the outcome. The court secures it for you, and that decision alone accelerated everything that followed. If this part made you rethink how much one legal decision can change everything, comment with Bond Matters if you agree, or tell us why you don't. And if you value this level of explanation, subscribe to the channel. It is just one click, and it directly supports the work we put into these videos. Jai, courts are patient by design, but that patience has defined limits. One of the clearest signals that this case was reaching a breaking point was the judge's reaction to the defense strategy itself. Arguments that had already been rejected were brought back again and again. Claims the court had clearly dismissed were repeated as if nothing had happened. From a legal standpoint, that is a dangerous game to play. Judges expect advocacy, but they also expect respect for prior rulings. When that line is crossed, credibility starts to collapse rapidly. This is why sanctions matter so much in a legal context. When a judge orders lawyers to personally pay penalties, it is not symbolic. It is a warning. It signals that the court believes arguments are being made in bad faith not to clarify the law, but to delay, distract, or overwhelm the process. Once a judge reaches that conclusion, everything tightens up. Jai. The court becomes less tolerant of risk, less willing to wait, and far more likely to take control of the situation directly. And that is exactly how asset freezes become more likely. If the court feels it can't rely on representations coming from one side, it won't leave critical issues like money and property unsupervised. Sanctioning the defense wasn't just about punishing behavior. It was about signaling that the court was done playing procedural games. From that moment on, the judge wasn't just evaluating arguments, he was actively managing risk, and freezing assets became part of that management. If this made you realize how much lawyer behavior can shape a case, comment with credibility counts if you agree, or explain why you see it differently. And if you respect the effort behind these breakdowns, subscribe to the channel. It is one click, and it helps us keep producing content like this. Jai. One reason the court couldn't just freeze a single account or one property is the way the business itself is built. The Trump Organization isn't a simple one-property operation. It is a vast network of entities, subsidiaries, and holdings that all connect back to a central control point. From a judge's perspective, that structure creates a serious enforcement problem. If money can move freely between related entities, freezing one piece while leaving others untouched doesn't actually protect anything. This kind of setup makes asset tracing incredibly difficult. Funds can be transferred internally with ease. Assets can be reclassified, and ownership can shift on paper without any cash ever leaving the system. Judges are well aware of this vulnerability. That is why when courts see centralized control over a complex web of assets, they don't pick and choose. They go broad. Jai. Freezing everything connected to the core entity becomes the only way to ensure the court's future orders actually mean something. This isn't about assuming guilt beyond what's already been ruled. It is about containment. The court needed to lock down the entire structure to prevent selective movement that could undermine enforcement later. In cases involving smaller defendants, limited freezes might work. In cases involving sprawling business empires, partial measures invariably fail. The structure itself forced the court's hand, and once that reality set in, a comprehensive freeze wasn't extreme, it was the only practical option left. If this helped you understand why courts go big instead of surgical, comment structure matters if it clicked for you. And if you value this level of clarity, subscribe to the channel. It is just one click, and it helps us keep doing this work. JR. A lot of people hear civil case and assume it is somehow softer or less serious than a criminal one. That misunderstanding is dangerous, and in this situation, it is completely wrong. Civil enforcement gives courts enormous power, especially when the goal is financial accountability. Unlike criminal cases, which focus on guilt and punishment, civil cases focus on control, restitution, and prevention. And that is exactly why this case escalated so quickly. In a civil fraud case, judges don't need to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't need a jury verdict to start acting. Once liability is established, courts can impose fines, strip business licenses, ban executives from operating companies, and place organizations under supervision. That makes civil courts uniquely effective at dismantling financial systems that courts believe are being abused. JAI. When fraud is proven in civil court, the response is often immediate and sweeping. This is why asset freezes are so common in major civil fraud cases. The goal isn't to punish emotionally, it is to secure outcomes. Courts want to ensure that money exists to pay penalties, compensate damages, and enforce future rulings. And in many cases, civil penalties can be financially devastating in ways criminal sentences are not. Losing control of businesses, assets, and revenue streams can reshape someone's entire financial life. That is why this civil case is not a side story. It is the main event. If this changed how you view the power of civil courts, comment with Civil Week if you agree, or tell us why you don't. And if you appreciate the depth behind these explanations, subscribe to the channel. It is one click, and it helps us keep delivering this content. JAI. This is the moment where everything shifts from a legal battle to a historical event. Freezing the assets of a former president isn't just rare, it is unprecedented. Courts are extremely cautious when dealing with figures who once held immense power, not because they are above the law, but because every move sets a precedent. And in this case, the court clearly decided that the rule of law outweighed political status. That decision alone makes this moment extraordinary. What pushed it over that line was accumulation. Not one issue, not one document, not one witness, but a growing stack of rulings, evidence, inconsistencies, and risks that finally reached a point where inaction became more dangerous than action. At that stage, the court wasn't making a political statement. It was making a legal one. The message was simple. Prior power does not grant permanent immunity, especially in financial matters where the system depends on trust. This is why legal experts are watching this case so closely. What happens here could reshape how courts approach accountability for powerful figures going forward. It sets a benchmark. It shows that civil courts can step in decisively when they believe financial misconduct threatens the integrity of the system itself. Regardless of how this case ends, the line has already been crossed. And once history moves, it doesn't move backward. If you think this moment will be remembered years from now, comment with one word you'd use to describe it. And if you value clear, no-spin breakdowns like this, subscribe to the channel. It is just one click, and it helps us keep doing the work that matters. JAR.